Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 4th of August 2024. I don't know how frequently I'm going to be able to do Frontline updates for the next 2 weeks because I am going to be away. It's quite a time consuming thing, and that will be the most difficult thing for me to do whilst out of my house on holiday. But I will try. I will try to see if I can. Okay, let's go. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the screen at the moment, and that's the key to the map. Okay, when we go to the frontline map, we can see there's a number of blue pins on the map today. This is a 2-day update, so quite a lot of movement, given that I haven't done a mapping update for 48 hours. So 2 lots of days worth of movement, including quite a bit of blue movement, according to Surat maps. Although, as ever with Surat maps, even if they claim this is a counterattack from the Ukrainians, it is often not a counterattack, and the case that the initial mapping of Russian gains was overzealous, and they sell it as the Ukrainians have done a counterattack without. Sometimes they say, oh, okay, we've got new information and there's a mapping correction. But sometimes they say it's a counterattack when I'm not too sure it is a counterattack. The first one we'll look at is in one of the 2 northern sectors north of Kharkiv, where you've got the Geopolitics one directly north and then the one northeast, where Vovchansk is still very dynamic. There's lots of activity going on here. The Ukrainians used an unmanned ground vehicle to destroy a building the other day. That was reported by reporting from Ukraine. Andrew Perpetua talked about this area on his live stream, how there's just lots of activity going on. It is really dynamic. I think he fundamentally disagrees that this is controlled by the Russians. I think they periodically do control and then not control areas here. And so, go and check out his live stream to talk about Vovchansk. We're actually going to go further to the west, to northwest of Staritsia, where you've got this large amount. I mean, really is quite a sizable area of territory going to the Ukrainians. My guess is that would have been claimed that they had taken all this area initially, and either they actually didn't have robust control and have seeped back, or they never really did control right up to there. They might have had some vehicles driving around here, but then really they're concentrating on Vovchansk and Staritsia. I don't know, but it's communicated at the moment here, as you can see, quite a large amount of land there by Surat maps as new correction was made, showing the border positions northwest of Staritsia was also retaken by Ukrainian army between the last days of June and the first week of July. So that is to say, it's a correction, but it was a counterattack that happened, goodness me, over a month ago. Last days of June 1st. So that, over a month ago, that was taken. But obviously, there's some evidence now to suggest that is under Ukrainian control. That's really good news, chipping away at this control zone. But if you look, that is exactly where Andrew Perpetua has had that line anyway. So this is not a case of the Ukrainians, I think, counterattacking in the last 24, 48 hours. But then maybe they did counterattack at some point, or maybe it was overzealous mapping. So that is that usual kind of blue pin explanation there with regard to Surat maps, a pro-Russian mapper. No change to Kupiansk-Svatovo front line in the northeastern axis, or Pischany area, that the Russians have made some fairly sizable gains. No change there, or Stelmakivka. But there is some change here in Makivka, which is, I think, important with regard to Ukrainian success around here and holding on to Makivka on the Zherebets River. Now, this could equally be an overzealous original mapping, as the Russians took that area. Surat Maps explains this as during the last 2 weeks, Ukrainian army managed to recapture most of the locality of Makivka. So either the Ukrainians are doing a really good counterattack around here, or the Russians never really had robust control over that. It was probably grey zone, and now there's evidence that the Russians have been bombing or shelling the Ukrainians in these positions, and it's like, okay, that's evidence that the Russians do not control that area. So that is the claim from Surat Mats. Now, in Institute for the Study of War, so as I do look at my ATP Geo atpgeo.youtuber youtube.erg.uy, as Benny Pie has sorted out for me. There's some nice little condensed summaries of the different areas. And if we look at the Kupiansk area, it says Russian forces recently advanced northwest of Crimea with geolocated footage indicated advances within southern Makivka. So that is a claim here. So although we are now seeing that the Russians have been pushed back in Makivka or never really had control over that amount of land, there is some claim that the Russians are in certain positions, which is 135th Battalion of the 114th Assault Brigade use FPV drones to attack Russian positions in Makivka. And so we have this geolocation. Oops, see if I can get that correctly. Okay, let's plug that in. So these are where the Russians are at. Ukrainians hitting them with drones at this point, which is inside the area that, interestingly, the Surrey Maps has now rolled back. The question always is, when was this recorded? Difficult to say. So Ukrainians are hitting Russians there. Likely that is just exactly what this map suggests, that would be the grey zone. That Russians don't control it. They're trying to move into Makivka. Ukrainians are hitting them with drones. That would be my likely explanation for that. But anyway, some movement back in Ukraine's favour there, as according to Surrey Maps, although yet again for a disparity in the claims between Surrey Maps and Andrew Perpetua. Andrew Perpetua never had the Russians controlling that in the first place. Still, Surrey Maps has them controlling part of Makivka to the south. So again, good news for the Ukrainians, although difficult to know exactly what has been going on there. Then Andrew Perpetua has some small gains towards Terny for the Russians. Literally just, a part of this field between two tree lines there. It's very different still from what Surrey Maps has. And they have the Russians controlling another 1.5 kilometers worth of land there, maybe a little bit more along this wooded area. Andrew Perpetua no doubt has that as grey zone. Some fairly considerable differences between the mappers all around this northern part of Terny. And indeed south towards Serebiansky Forest, some quite big difference between the mappers there around Dubrova. No change to this first front line. Andrew Perpetua in his live stream did lots of talk about this area of Ivano-Dorivka. And he says the Ukrainians definitely control the town there. And he says he's almost certain they control this whole tree line down here. And what happens is these deep reconnaissance groups are somehow getting all the way up to here. And he says that the Ukrainians definitely control Sperna. And so there's a really big difference between the mappers. So Surrey Maps has the Russians fully in control of Sperna, fully in control of Ivano-Dorivka, and controlling all of this area. Andrew Perpetua looks at loads more data more granularly. He spends a lot more time looking at the stuff than Surrey Maps, that's for sure, because when you look at the amount of mapping that Surrey Maps does, not just for this front line, but also for all the other, like Syria and all these other places in Africa, I don't know what team of people, or whether it's a singular person, or if he just listens to the MOD and says, right, I'm mapping that as per what the MOD says, then there's not a lot of critical analysis going on. So I definitely put Andrew Perpetua above Surrey Maps, although Surrey Maps can sometimes, if the Russian MOD are occasionally correct in what they claim, Surrey Maps will have that before Andrew Perpetua. Andrew will wait for evidence to support that. So sometimes Surrey Maps is ahead of the game, sometimes predictive of places that will eventually be taken. This was one where a flag was dropped here by a drone, and it was unclear from the video footage as to who actually controlled this area and who the people were in the video. They could have been Ukrainians, could have been Russians, but it was dropped on a house and then removed, as far as I know. But that was like suddenly that precipitated this huge gain for the Russians. Now, as mentioned, Andrew says Spearnet is definitely controlled by the Ukrainians. Ivano-Dorivka is definitely controlled, and this tree line down here. But there are some attacks that are definitely taking place up and around here. He says this is part of a larger attempt to take Seversk. He's of the opinion that Seversk is one of the most important places on the front line at the moment. He said Seversk and Konstantinivka. So this place here, that the reason why Chasiv Yar is being attacked is because they want to get to Konstantinivka, which is what they want from Toretsk and New York to get up to here. That's more important, arguably, than Pokrovsk, because it unlocks all of these areas and really this whole front line, I guess, all around here, and the Donbass as a whole. So Konstantinivka is that crucial crossroads to so many other places. So Seversk is, I guess, you know, well, Seversk is I guess like not quite as important as that, but yet as important as that, because really you can't take the whole of the Donbass without taking this area here. And Seversk is the key to the Serebryansky forest, to the Solidar region, right up to Torska. And they really want to take that, but they failed by failing in Verkhnokamianska, failing in Bilahorivka. That's very difficult for the Russians to take. And they're having a little bit of trouble around Spirna, but they are moving up from towards Vimka and in the Rozdalivka area. So he's saying that actually this Rozdalivka push that's been more successful recently could well be their chance of trying to get to Seversk. He says at this rate they won't take it for 2 years, but this is all part of the attempt to get to Seversk. So that's your goal. Ivana Derivka, this mapping from Surat Maps is definitely incorrect to some large degree. Quite what the Russians control around it, because there's no village here. So like when you say they control like a bit of rocky outcrop, like what does that mean? They don't have a person standing there. Like there aren't people standing every 50 meters all around here to signify that they control this land. What this usually means is they've been there and then they might have come out. Who controls it? The reality is probably no one controls this whole area, which is what Andrew Perpetua has. I don't know what his grey zone is and how big that is around here, but arguably my synopsis is that arguably all of this is grey zone, though they do control, the Ukrainians do control, as according to Andrew, definitely certain areas of that grey zone: Spirna, Ivana Derivka, and that tree line. Okay, so that's that. Some claims about Chaziv Yar will come down to some. Well, first of all, we'll look at Chaziv Yar itself, where the Russians are fighting in here. Julian Rutke yesterday talked about how they're fighting in these streets on the other side of the canal now, so fighting in this area. We have Surat Maps. No, actually, we won't go to that one. We'll go to Chaziv Yar, which is another geolocation from the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank. Russian forces recently advanced within Chaziv Yar with geolocated footage confirming the capture of further ground west of Seversk Donbass Canal in northeastern Zhovetnevy microrayon in eastern Chaziv Yar. Fighting continued along the line there, and this is the geolocation. Where am I going? Bloody hell. Here is the geolocation given by the ISW. So the Ukrainian 23rd Brigade attacking Russian positions with drones here. It's all geolocated. Impact here. And there are a couple, actually, of Russians getting shelled. But remember, Russians being here, as I say so many times, does not necessarily mean they control this. It means they're attacking that and they're getting hit by the Ukrainian defences. So in this case, there is evidence that Russians are there. And as I've said 1,000,001 times, the Russians are there. For the interpretation for that, for Andrew Perpetua, is that that's a grey zone. The Russians are attacking into it. The interpretation for Surat Maps is they are there, therefore they control it. And that's your difference, and that's why the two mappers have a very different interpretation as to what the front lines are. Now, the Russians have been shelled in this position as well. Yeah, so two places relatively, or very close to each other, indicating that Russians are definitely attacking across the canal. So the Russians have 100% got across the canal. Do they control this area? Will they control this area? Probably. Is this prescient? Probably. Will they take the whole of Chaziv Yar? Probably. It will be a tough grind, and we'll just have to see. But it's certainly they've been slower here than they were hoping to be. They're hoping to have that wrapped up by the end of summer. But yeah, definitely challenging for the Ukrainians as the Russians have got across the canal into Chaziv Yar proper. Then we have some gains for the Russians just south of Ivanivska here, between Ivanivska and Klishchivka. Surat Map says that the Russians made small advances. Clashes between the Ukrainian army and Russian forces continue on the western hills of Klishchivka without significant changes during the month of July. However, we don't have an admission of this. There's no tweet that I've seen. Maybe I've missed one. But for me, this is a classic. Yeah, let's quietly just accept that I was wrong there. And he had already accepted Surat Maps that he had been wrong here previously, and then suddenly it all came back. What am I talking about? If you remember, Klishivka exists on this low point behind. So to the northwest of Klishivka is this bluff, this hill that goes up. And that means Klishivka is very hard to control because you just get hit from the heights here. And if you control the heights here, yeah, you might nominally control Klishivka, but there's no real basements. All houses have been rubberized. It is just a bit of a big grey zone, which is why Andrew Perpetua has that as a grey zone and not under Russian control. And Surat Maps has that under Russian control. Of course, they do. In fact, all of this area is seen as under Russian control according to Surat Maps, and Andrew Perpetua has the Russians behind the railway line there. Anyway, what the important point of this hill is, or this kind of bluff is, this high ground. The really Klishivka is all about these trench lines on that bluff, on that hill, and these trench lines. Andrew Perpetua said months ago that these were definitely controlled by the Ukrainians. There's lots of evidence to suggest that, and Surat Maps had the Russians taking control of all of this just in one day. So it's never happened. Then Surat Maps actually rolled that all back, and then like less than a week later, put it all under Russian control again. And it seems to be that Surat Maps is just going in line with, I think, Russian MOD claims about Klishivka, but this is one of these ones that appeared to be the Russians claiming things that just simply are not true. And Andrew is like, there's definitely, I mean, I've got evidence of the Ukrainians in these trench lines. Certainly this whole area, certainly over here. Here it's maybe a little bit more arguable around that point near to where the Russian lines definitely are, as according to Andrew, but this trench line definitely under Ukrainian control. Now that was some time back. I don't know what the situation now for Andrew is, his interpretation of that trench line, but it's interesting that suddenly Surat Maps has just taken the Russians out of controlling all of this area, including a very large sort of wooded area there, and a large proportion of that very important trench line northwest of Klishivka. And I would just think that that's correction after like definite evidence of Russians not controlling that has come out. It'd be interesting to see whether, you know, there are other things that are rolled back around here, or, you know, it seems unlikely that the Russians would definitely control Klishivka in the way that, from the way I understand it, you know, both sides run in, attack, and then get out because there's no shelter there. It's just very difficult. And if you control the high ground here, then hanging around Klishivka ain't a good idea. So anyway, some more blue pins there, but that might not be a counterattack. It might be an overzealous bit of mapping initially, and that's essentially what you can say for all three blue areas. Maybe they counterattacked Makivka just recently, the Ukrainians, and maybe they did counterattack up in Storitsia, but it was over a month ago. And then really everything else is a case of the Russians making their usual advances. So we have both mappers admitting that the Russians have advanced into Toretsk. Indeed, they're about 50 meters apparently from the kind of city limits of Toretsk. So there's fighting, I think, all around here that is pretty heavy. But they're not in Toretsk yet. But I assume it's going to be a matter of time. The Russians have definitely been making considerable gains around here. The key might be this Terrakon, this high spoilings heap there from the mining that takes place in the area. That could be challenging, but the Russians did seem to take this without too much pushback from the Ukrainians. But yeah, making some significant gains around there. Surat Maps says no, actually there's no tweet to go alongside those gains. No change in New York, which is good news. Then when we come down to the Prokrovsk direction, there's a couple of things to know. I'd advise going to watch Andrew Perpetua's live stream where he talks a lot about this area, and he says that this road up here, which is actually a railway line, they're using it as a road to get their supplies in. He says this is essentially a road of death, as in it is the logistics around here the Russians are getting hammered. He says this is a graveyard of Scooby-Doo vans, of Pakankas, these loaf vans. The vehicles are just, if they don't go along there, they have to go around these back roads, which have already been knackered, and they're under fire control. And he said, right back here, it's the logistics are an absolute issue. And he says this is translating into the Russian soldiers around here not having water, not having food often, and obviously supplies are difficult to come by in terms of munitions. He thinks that this area will start grinding to a much slower set of gains. The Russians are making consistently decent gains all around here. At some point, they're going to meet the proper Ukrainian fortifications here. But I guess the silver lining for the Ukrainians is that they have done such a good job of hammering the Russians with their drones. The Ukrainian drones around here are having a really good, successful time of taking out Russian logistics. And importantly, Magyar's birds are there. So if you remember, Magyar's birds were causing issues when the Ukrainians were at Krinky. They were the ones responsible for hammering Russian both logistics and equipment around here to the tune of hundreds of pieces of kit. Then when Kharkiv was attacked, they were brought up here and they switch it around to change it from the Ukrainians taking more losses to the Russians taking more equipment losses up here. And they've hammered the Russians so that the logistics around here are particularly difficult, and around Lyubimka as well, so that the Russians have had to put their logistics back behind the border. And essentially from the border to the front line, it's just kind of run the gauntlet. So that was Magyar's birds. He has not only just very well-trained pilots, very good experience, but they also have the best kit. So he manages to do a lot of fundraising and gets incredibly good electronic warfare, countermeasures, and drones himself. The argument is that really Ukraine could do with having that right across all of their units. There's another unit operating around here that's also taking huge amounts of Russian equipment casualties. And so this is obviously Ukraine have said, right, this is our most desperate area. Let's get our best guys in there. And that's why you got Magyar's birds and other units. And they are taking significant casualties. And we are seeing that reflected on the front line, on the losses, the loss statistics that I share with you every day. So the Russians are making these gains. I can imagine they're throwing everything into this. Andrew Perpetua is showing some gains for the Russians in this area, south of Vovcha. But actually not agreeing, at least yet, with the gains that Surrey Maps is claiming. Quite wide-ranging differences, wide-ranging interpretations of what's going on here. Ivanivka is mainly under control of the Russians, according to Surrey Maps, and not as according to Andrew Perpetua. And then some pretty big differences around here. It probably will come. It seems to be actually what happens that Surrey Maps might not be correct to begin with, but it ends up being true, or is correct initially, and Andrew Perpetua takes more time to get more evidence together. But then going south here from Novopokrovska and Novoselivka, Persia, moving south towards Mazhova here, the Russians moving down south there. So they are making these gains consistently around here. Andrew's silver lining is that logistics are a nightmare for the Russians, and the Ukrainians are able to hammer those vehicles, and that will no doubt lead to, he thinks, a slowing down of the Russian advances here. So we'll see if that is indeed a correct prediction as the days go by. And then when we come, you can see some of that in the mapping of Surat Maps here. So Ivanivka has been half taken by the Russians up until the school there, and they've also advanced southwest and west of Novoselivka, Persia, as I mentioned, and entered in the first houses of Mazhova, which is actually interesting. So that's possibly just up there, a few houses on that bend as it comes down towards Mazhova down there. Anyway, yeah, so that is challenging for the Ukrainians, that area. Then we have the Russians moving further northwest into the other northern suburbs of Krasnohorivka. So the main town or city of Krasnohorivka is under control of the Russians now, and it's just about slowly moving to take more and more of the settlement in this northwestern area. Surat Maps here has the claim that the Russian army took control over the remaining areas of Zalizhne Oh no, that's a load of rubbish. That's what it does occasionally. So, situation west of Donetsk, the Russian army began advancing in the northern part of Krasnohorivka along the streets of Syedova and Oktyabrskaya streets there. So, okay, that is that for the rest of the front line. No change to Marinka, to Novomikhailivka, down south here. I have a feeling Andrew was, I don't know if it's around here, saying they hadn't got this far, or there was another place where he's saying a flag had been dropped on top of an SUV, I presume a destroyed SUV by drone, and then that was the idea that they are in control of the road, and it might be here. And his I think interpretation was like definitely not in control of the road. That would fall in line with the sort of things throughout Maps does, which is there's a flag there, therefore they control it. But you can drop flags with drones now, in the same way that on the other side of the Dnipro River, Ukraine was often dropping flags on water towers, and then that doesn't mean that they controlled that area, and no one changed the mapping there. And yet, as soon as flags are dropped elsewhere, Surat maps will change. If they're Russian flags, then Surat maps will change the map. What interestingly around here, what the Ukrainians were doing a couple of times is dropping flags, and then a human would go up the water tower, climb up the water tower to take the flag off, and then they would hit the human with drones. So FPV drones would take that human out in the middle of climbing up. So yeah, that sounds pretty horrible to me. I mean, that's war, isn't it? But it could well be that back over here towards the road between this other Konstantinivka and Vuhledar, it could be that Russians do not control the land that Surat maps claimed previously, and that would be good news for the Ukrainians, because that is a worry, that the interdiction of that road. But nonetheless, I mean, that road's going to be under something of a lot of fire control, I would have thought, no, even if the Russians haven't interdicted it fully. Right, so no change to the southern front line at all, which is good news for the Ukrainians. Quite a mixed bag there. Hopefully that was informative. I don't know when my next ones will come out. Always check out Andrew Perpetua's live streams if you're interested in mapping updates and what's going on in individual sort of tree lines, and also general appraisals of things as well. They're just full of lots of juicy nuggets that might be interesting for you guys. So if you don't already subscribe to Andrew's live streams, please do. Right, that's enough from me. Thank you so much for listening. Take care, guys. Speak to you soon. Doodle pips.